Good morning. Today is the 28th day of Second Adar and the 7th of April. We're starting a new parsha, one that is very interesting. It has to do with the only disease that's discussed in the Torah. Not only is it discussed in the Torah, but we learn about the disease itself, its diagnosis, and how it was cured. And as you would expect, this is not a regular disease. Even though it appears to be a physical ailment, it's actually very spiritual. And from it, we need to learn about all diseases, even though, again, it's special. The usual explanation that you would find is that tzarat, as we'll see, is something that would afflict someone who was otherwise of, as Moshe Vishnevsky writes here, of sterling character and moral excellence, who have committed the sin of gossip, slander, or haughtiness. So that'll be our topic for most of the week. But today, on the first day of Tazria, we're going to be looking at the first portion. The first portion begins with the commandments that have to do with giving birth. And obviously the most important commandment that has to do with giving birth is that on the 8th day, if it's a male child, he's circumcised. But apart from that, the first portion deals with the impurity or defilement that accompanies childbirth, regardless of whether it's a male or a female. And in fact, the defilement, meaning the effect on the mother giving birth, is greater when it's a daughter than when it is a male. So the first verses read like this. God spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelites, saying, if a woman..." Now, the translation here is a little bit tricky, but the way we need to read it is that if a woman when she produces seed and gives birth to a male, she will be impure for 7 days. The days, the same degree as the days of her menstrual flow, which also renders her impure. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin must be circumcised. So, and then for 33 days she will remain in a state of non-defilement. She cannot become impure. So that's the beginning. And the words that we want to focus on are a woman when she produces seed, Isha ki Tazria, and gives birth to a male, ve'yalda zachar. This is Leviticus 12, verse 2. Now, there's so much to say about this. Really, this is one of the greatest topics that we could talk about in terms of knowing what the context was in the ancient times. We don't know all the way back to Moses' time what the way they saw or how they saw the creation of the conception of a child, exactly how they thought it worked. But we see the echoes of it in the Greek philosophers and the medicine or the medical world that existed in the first millennium before the Common Era. Here we'd have to go another 1,000 years back, so I don't know if we have any good other sources. I've never encountered any. But this may be the best source on how this was seen in the ancient times. That a woman, when she produces seed and gives birth to a male, what does that mean? Isha ki Tazria ve'yalda zachar. It means that a woman they knew had seed. That may seem like a strange word to us because we don't think of women as having seed. But we certainly think of women as having an ovum, the egg. And think about how different than this is than the context that would want to say then maybe it's a patriarchal world in which it's only the male that determines the gender of the conceived child. Think about this for a second, that our modern understanding is that it is only the male that determines the gender of the child, and it's not the woman. And here we have a far more feminine-leaning picture of nature. So there's a lot to be said about this and exactly how this developed through the centuries, and until we came to our modern conception, which is very, very much masculine-oriented. All of genetics today is very heavily leaning towards the masculine side of things. There's a lot to be said about that. There has been a lot said about that. Since the 90s, there have been some important researchers who have noted this and showed that it doesn't, as much as science maybe tries to be objective, can't run away from the general atmosphere that the researchers who do the research share. So anyway, what we want to do is we want to look at this in a different way. We want to understand from this, a woman, when she produces seed and gives birth to a male, there's no opposite. There's no when a male produces seed and gives birth to a female, although this does appear in the Talmud. The Talmud gives the counterpart, the other side. So what do we do with this, and how do we take a statement like this and in a sense use it given our modern understanding of genetics? Again, without claiming for a moment that modern genetics is the final statement about how things work in the world. It's the one that we have right now. So the fundamental theory of genetics states that genes, which are chains of nucleotides in our DNA that are at the core of the characteristics of every living organism, act in pairs. Genes act in pairs. One gene is described as dominant, and the other is viewed as recessive. For example, in humans, one pair of genes defines the individual eye color, brown or blue. So in this pair, the brown gene is considered dominant and blue is recessive. What this means is that if the individual receives one half of his DNA from his father and the other half from his mother, if one of those halves contains a gene that codes for brown eyes, even if the other contains a gene for blue eyes, the child's eye color, the phenotype, will be brown. Only if both sets of DNA from both parents contain the genes that code for blue eyes will the child sport blue eyes. Interestingly, this model allows us to describe gender. Now this is a leap in and of itself. But gender as another characteristic of the body that is determined by a pair of genes, one coding for male, the other for female. There are genes involved, many of them, and these genes are located on chromosomes, which are long strands of DNA material that can contain hundreds and thousands of genes. The two chromosomes that code for male and female genders are known as the Y, the male chromosome, and it's actually called Y because it's like a little piece, and X, the female chromosome, which is just a lot larger. So the Y is really not really a Y. It's just like a piece of the top of the X. It's just much smaller. These names actually describe the physical shape of the two chromosomes. As we said, to code for a male phenotype, the child's DNA must have YX chromosomes. To code for a female, the child's DNA must have XX. So what do we have here? That the Y, which dictates that the child will be male, is relatively dominant. Here we're talking about a whole chromosome. It's a whole set of genes. It's not just one gene. It's a whole set of genes that are relatively dominant to the X chromosome, which codes for the female. And so only if you get XX, the two recessive, as it were, recessive chromosomes, will you get a female. And this reflects the sage's statement, a very famous statement that is associated with the explanation of the verse, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and conquer it." The sages say it is the nature of the male to conquer, it is not the nature of the female to conquer. So it would make sense that the male here is dominant. However, it seems that the contribution of the child's gender phenotype is not equally weighted between the father and the mother. The mother who has XX can only contribute an X chromosome, thus only the father can contribute a Y chromosome from his YX configuration. It is the father alone that determines the child's gender, and this is what we said. This is the modern way that we look at this. Yet the Torah seems to state that the mother too plays a role. Not only also plays a role, it seems that she's the only one who plays a role. We said that the sages added to this the flip side, which is if a man produces seed, then there will come out a female. But again, that doesn't fit our modern understanding. In any case, so a woman, when she produces seed and gives birth to a male, it seems to say that the woman's definitely contributing to the gender of the child. The way to reconcile the two views regarding the woman's contribution to her offspring's gender is by recognizing that the genetic model treats the recessive gene as non-contributing and non-active in the individual organism. This is very important. In general, if you're a female and you have two X chromosomes, one is inactive. If it were active, you'd be in trouble. You're not supposed to have two copies of the same gene acting at the same time. The reason it is carried by an individual is to allow its transmission to future generations of the species. So what do we do with recessive genes? Or, for instance, if you have blue eyes, so only one pair of the genes, only one side of the genes actually codes for the blue eyes, and then the recessive one is inactive, and the only reason it's there is to allow future generations to also carry the same gene. So case in point, the X chromosome in the male is recessive again, in quotes, since the male's phenotype does not rely on the X chromosome, the second X chromosome. The male's female chromosome, specifically, it does not rely on the gender-determining genes on the X chromosome. Similarly, in a woman, the second X chromosome is deemed recessive, in a sense, as far as determining her gender. But according to Torah, everything has value, even here and now, not just in the future. In fact, it is specifically those things that seem recessive or inactive, rendering them passive, as it were, that constitute the secret of success. This is also the secret of the Jewish people, as alluded to in the sage's statement that our calendar is based on the moon, Yisrael Munin Lalvana, whose light is passive, since it originates in the sun, while the nations base their calendar on the sun, which is dominant. Again, this is a general statement. There are nations that base their calendar on the moon, but we say, in general, all of them base it on the sun. That's why tomorrow is a bad omen, as it were. That's the way that they would see it. They all see it as a bad omen, which means, again, that they do base their calendar on the sun, because tomorrow will be a full solar eclipse in the United States. So whether you're a Muslim or a Christian, it's all the same. It's a bad omen, supposedly. For a Jew, it's nothing. Okay. We must conclude then that the recessive X chromosome is not meaningless in either the male nor the female. In the male, it functions as a concealed feminine attribute, while in the female, it acts as a concealed male attribute. Think about this. The recessive gene in the male, so I have YX, my X chromosome is a recessive feminine attribute. That's where my feminine qualities come from. While in the female, it flips, and the X chromosome, the recessive, the second one, XX, so the second one, right, is a little x, it's actually a concealed male attribute. To illustrate what this might mean, what could the recessive X chromosome contribute? We can recount a story told about the Rebbe of Kotsk. One of his Hasidim came to him and complained that even though the Torah states that he, the man, will rule over you, the woman, Vuim Sholbach, in his house, the situation is reversed and his wife rules over him. So the Kotzker replied, Menachem Mendel of Kotsk replied that the Torah statement is indeed eternal, but the full phrase reads, your urge shall be for your husband, meaning first the wife has to have an urge for her husband, and because of that, he will rule over you. Only if you have an urge, only if the woman has an urge for her husband, will the husband rule. If the wife is the one yearning for her husband, then he will rule over her. But if it is you, as in your case, that you yearn for your wife, you're the one who's waiting for your wife, the Rebbe concluded the situation is reversed. On our verse, the sages state, Rabbi Yitzchak says in the name of Rabbi Ami, if the woman emits seed first, she gives birth to a male, and if the man emits seed first, like we said, the sages already give us the counterpart, she gives birth to a female. As it is stated, a woman, when she produces seed and gives birth to a male. So how should we understand this? So let's say like this. The woman and the man in this passage and the statement from the sages can be interpreted metaphorically. Again, this is not the verse now. We're looking at how Rabbi Ami opens up the entire statement. If when a woman produces seed, it gives birth to a male. So if the man produces seed, it gives birth to a female. We're going to understand this whole statement now metaphorically, including the verse, but beyond the verse. We'll say like this: whoever is attracted first in what is known as an awakening from below to connect with the other is referred to as the woman. The woman is always the awakening from below. So we're going to say that whoever is attracted first is called the woman here. Thus, if it is the husband that is drawn to his wife, he awakens his woman, i.e. his recessive X chromosome, and therefore a girl will be born, because he's giving his X, and his wife only has XX, so she only has two X's, so they can only form together XX. But if it is the wife who is attracted to her husband, it is her woman. What did we say about her woman, her recessive gene? Her recessive gene is her masculine side, her concealed masculine side, the recessive X in the XX of the woman. So her recessive X chromosome, which then will awaken, and it will draw spiritually in a way that you could check this in some way. There should be a way you could check this under a microscope. A sperm with a dominant Y chromosome, and the child will be a boy. What we've just done is we've taken a statement from the sages and we've understood it metaphorically, because this is how you have to understand what they're saying. They're not saying things as scientists. They're not scientists. That's not what they're about. That's not what they talk about. The sages are masters of Torah, not of science. They don't sit in a lab and they don't even do astronomical observations in order to try to understand how the world works. That's not their job. That's not what they are experts at. What they are expert at is understanding the spiritual side of the Torah, the Torah itself. And in the Torah, the way that we are understanding them now is that whomever awakens first is the feminine here, is the woman here. And if it's the woman, so she gives her recessive X chromosome, forcing, as it were, the Y chromosome from the male to join it, because her recessive is masculine. It forces the masculine from the male, the Y chromosome, to join it. So therefore you get the male. On the other hand, if it's the male who's the woman here, so he's awakening his recessive X chromosome, which is feminine, and because of that he's drawing the feminine from his wife, and therefore the offspring, if the male is awakened first, will be a girl. And this is a way to understand what the sages said in a way that would fit what we have today. This is pretty much what we have today, except for one big difference. We don't see this. We don't see these awakenings. We're not aware of them. To the best of my knowledge, nobody's ever traced what exactly happens during conception. Is there a possibility that one type of semen is stronger and is able to attract, as opposed to the other type, which isn't? And the same thing would be with the ovums. You know, that there's a number of ovums that are always ready to be inseminated. What is an awakening in a woman? How is it? Is this awakening, does it take 5 minutes? Does it take 5 days? Does it take 50 hours? There's no way to really know. But this is a way to look at all of this in order to make some connection between how the sages saw it and how modern science sees it. And there's no necessarily any contradiction. Again, there's a whole process here that we don't know about physically, but that they apparently argue exists spiritually. So thanks for joining me today, and tomorrow we're going to get into the thick of the tzarat, the whole leprosy business. See you tomorrow.